Washington, D.C., and the Lord has given him a great capacity to move forward in racial reconciliation and to see the body of Christ united. So we asked him to come and share with us on this important topic. Yeah.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So yeah, just wanted to just jump right in, and we have a lot of things planned for the next 2 days. But what I wanted to talk about in this short time right now is on the board right here. But even more than that, is we want to talk about some of the principles about how we can engage our cities, especially because this whole track is about engaging our cities with the gospel and seeing the kingdom flourish in urban centers, in the urban context. And we have a particular focus on inter-ethnic, cross-ethnic ministries, right? We have this focus about how, especially in the 21st century, as all the nations are converging, and especially as the U.S. is receiving so many different people groups, how do we engage that? How do we get involved in what God is doing through that? And so, what I want to do is just lay out some basic principles or some ideas that we have about how we can best do that, and how we can be the most effective at engaging. So it's going to be a little bit more ideological right now, and then we're going to move into the practical later, just to give you a warning. And so I really just had a few things I wanted to just talk about briefly that we felt were important ideas, concepts that we should really receive from the Lord and really adopt that would help us to engage multi-ethnic ministry in our cities in a better way, right? So the first thing I wanted to talk about is specifically the role of culture and address this issue. And the first point I wanted to make, or the first principle I wanted to put forth, is that culture matters, plain and simple. Just wanted to say that culture is important. Culture is the way in which we see the world. It's the way in which we interpret. To use anthropological language, culture is a system of interpretation of interpreting symbols and meaning. Right, so it's but to use more normal language, it's the way that we make sense of things, and it's the way that we share that understanding with a certain people group, right? And this affects how we see the gospel. It affects how we see God. It affects how we interpret the scriptures, and it affects all of us, like Lisa was just saying. One of the correctives that we'd like to offer to the way missions has been done is that oftentimes we have this perspective that other people have a culture. And other people has usually meant non-Western people, non-European people, right? We have this perspective that they have a culture that affects the way they see things, and so we have to work and do this process of contextualization that Lisa was just talking about for their sake, so that they can understand the gospel. But the problem in that is that the assumption is that we don't have a culture, and that, but also the other side of that coin is that we have the perfect understanding of the gospel. And it's almost like we have the market cornered on the gospel. We understand that there's no problems with us, there's only a problem with them. And so we have to help them understand the gospel. But that's not really true, and in that all of us have a culture. All of us are within a socio-historic cultural context, and all of us are affected by the way in which we see the gospel. Well, a missiologist that really foundational for me in my thinking is this guy, Andrew Walls, has this analogy. Some of you guys might have heard of him. He has this analogy about how the gospel and culture interact with each other. And the analogy he makes is the gospel is like a theater play in which the gospel, because like Lisa said, we're trying to talk about how we can understand all of the different stories of God's people, but how they all weave into one, right? How we're all in one story, right? So this isn't relativism in the sense that there's different paths to God. No, we all believe that there's one gospel, there's one Lord, there's one Jesus Christ, there's one scripture. And so Andrew Walls likens the gospel story to a play that's being acted out on the stage, and the church is the audience. Now the audience is very multifaceted, and they're placed at different locations in the theater. Some people are seeing it from the right, some people are seeing it from the left, some people are up in the front row, and they can maybe see the details a little bit more. Some people are in the balcony, and so they might not be able to see the details as well, but they can see the whole picture. They maybe have a better perspective of seeing everything, right? So and that's how we are as the church. We're all looking at the same gospel, but we're looking at it from different perspectives. And all of us have a perspective. None of us is kind of have the bird's eye view, the omnipotent point of view. All of us we only have one perspective, and therefore we can't know it all. But this is the problem with a lot of Western missionaries, is this assumption that we already understand it all, we already know it all. It's just these other people that need to be it needs to be interpreted for them. But all of us have a very limited perspective, and it's shaped in many ways by our culture. And so one way that I've seen this recently being played out in our ministry in DC with our church is one thing we like to do is we like to go outside every once in a while and just have some food and have like music and games and just interact with the neighborhood, because we're in a very rough neighborhood, probably the roughest neighborhood in Washington D.C. It's, very under-resourced, almost all African American community, and we want to engage with our neighbors, right? And so we've only been there a few years, but when we first started doing this thing, we wanted to. I should backtrack a little bit. We would always do this inside. And so we would go around and invite people in the neighborhood and say, hey, you guys want to come over? We're trying to engage with our neighbors. You want to come and we're going to have some food, fellowship, things like that. And it wasn't really working. It wasn't really taking off. And we weren't getting a lot of people to come. And we were just kind of brainstorming about this and wondering why this is happening. And then the Lord just showed us one day, it made more sense of the culture for us, that we noticed that, being in the community that we're in, and almost all poor African American community, that the way that people engage socially is that they're outside. That's how people in the hood. That's how people hang out. They're outside. That when you're on the block, you see people on porches, on street corners, in public areas hanging out. That's how people socialize. And so we didn't realize that by inviting them to come in, that we actually weren't realizing our own, I would say, middle class, cultural lens of that's what people do when you want to socialize. You go to someone's house. But we didn't realize that in this context, people don't go into other people's homes, because you might, especially in the hood, you might not want someone in your home. Or you might be embarrassed of your home, or you might not want them knowing what's going on in your home. And so, in the hood, when you want to socialize with people, you go outside. And when someone's inside, that's almost like the indicator that I don't want to be socializing right now. And then when someone comes and sits on their porch, that's kind of the social symbol that says, I'm ready to hang out now. And so we changed our method and we said, okay, we need to start bringing our food and our games and our music and everything outside. We need to go where the people are, because we need to understand the culture, right? But see, we wouldn't have been able to do that if we weren't also analyzing we were paying attention to the culture that we were in, but we also had to analyze our own culture and see how our own biases were affecting things. And that's just one example, but there's a million examples. I don't know how many times I've talked with a black preacher and just kind of shared funny stories and swap stories about experiences of being a black preacher speaking in white churches. And it's just always a funny conversation, because we always have to encourage each other and encourage ourselves that just because they're quiet doesn't mean that they're not into what you're saying. And that's something that we have to constantly remind ourselves of. Every time a black preacher's going to go speak, it says, it doesn't mean they're not into it, doesn't mean the Spirit's not moving. But it's a cultural perception, right? It's our perception that if you're into what I'm saying, if you're hearing the Lord through me, then you're going to be talking back to me. That's our cultural bias. And sometimes it's a negative bias that we apply to other people. Like, oh, those folks over there are so quiet in church. They must not really have the Holy Ghost. They must not really feel the Spirit because they're so quiet. And so we're judging them based on our bias. And then oftentimes it can work the other way. They're so loud. How can you even hear what the preacher's saying? You have to, and we even have that in our evangelical culture, right? We talk about quiet times. We have this, where did this quiet time thing come from? It's not in the Bible. I'm not saying that silence isn't good, and there is a place for that, but we have this priority on silence, on meditation, on being alone, right? And those things are good. Jesus did those things. But, that's not the only way to engage with God, right? And so just the way that our culture, our culture shapes how we see the gospel, and we all like to prioritize different things. And that's okay. The only problem is when things when one group, especially one group who has power, says the way I interpret things and the way I prioritize things is the way to do it. And that gets into the second point I wanted to make, which is that another principle that we really believe is important, and this might have been the thing that, as we keep kind of cautioning us to say, oh, the things might get uncomfortable, this might be the one that we were thinking of, I'm not sure. But while we think it's important to talk about, and the second point that we want to make is that Western cultural captivity of Christianity has to be rejected, okay? And I'll say that one more time. Western cultural captivity of Christianity has to be rejected. So I'm borrowing the phrase there from a friend and a mentor of mine, this guy named Sun Chan Ra. He's a professor at North Park Seminary, and he wrote this book called The Next Evangelicalism. And if you read through the table of contents in his book, every chapter begins with Western cultural captivity. So he likes to use this phrase, and I think it's a good one. It's kind of a play on Martin Luther's phrase, but it's a good concept. It's a good way of phrasing this concept of the way in which Christianity has been for so long associated with Western European culture. right? I think I hope we can all see that, no matter where you are in the world, people associate Christianity with whiteness, with Westernness, with Europeanness, and oftentimes today with Americanness, right? And that goes back a long, long way. I mean, we like to talk about, Constantine was the first Roman emperor to receive Christianity and became the, became a state religion. I think, personally, especially because early church is kind of my area of interest, I think actually even more, in relation to that, but even more powerfully than that, is the way in which, like, foundational Christian doctrine, right? Doctrine of the Trinity, doctrine of the person and work of Jesus Christ, these foundational doctrines that Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant all accept, they were created in a way that made sense to Greek-speaking people. And it was articulated, even these creeds that many of us recite, especially from mainland traditions, that they use vocabulary that has honestly more roots in Platonic thought than it does in the Bible. They're not in the Bible. I mean, I'm not saying I have a problem with the word, like, you guys probably familiar with, the doctrine of homoousios, right? That Jesus is homoousios, it's the same substance as the Father. But that's not a word that's in the Bible, but it's a word that made sense to the Greco-Roman mind. And then also this idea of Jesus having two persons in one nature, or two natures in one person, that these are Greco-Roman ideas that made sense to people in the Roman and Byzantine Empire. But they didn't make sense to people in Africa, for example, or people in the Middle East or in Asia. Because we have to remember that Christianity has just as much, if not longer, of a beginning in those places as it does in Europe. That Christianity is in Egypt, it's in Nubia, it's in Ethiopia, it's in Armenia. Armenia prides themselves on being the first Christian country, right? It's in my brother feels me right there. It's in the Middle East, it's in China, it's in India, it's everywhere, right? I mean, people like to talk about, Christianity is becoming this global religion. And I know what they're saying because it is in larger numbers becoming, the church is growing in other places that have been associated as being un-Christian. The 1040 window, I hate that phrase. But anyway, my point I want to bring up is it's always been there. It's always been there. We talk about the 1040 window, this place that there's no Christianity. I mean, that's what we mean by it, right? This dark place that God hasn't touched yet. And I mean, I want to say that the gospel has been, churches have been in places like Iraq, and places like, Jordan, and places like Lebanon and Egypt, longer than they were in Europe. So this idea of Christianity being a Western thing is a total fallacy, but it's a real concept. It's a real concept that touches every aspect of Christianity. When I was a youth pastor in Newark, New Jersey, I used to youth pastor predominantly Black and Latino youth in the inner city in Newark. And I remember this one time we were having youth group, and then it was over. We were having our fun time playing games, or whatever else. And I remember I think we had a predominantly Latino youth group, and I remember wanting to put on. I remember some of the Black kids wanting to put on like Kirk Franklin or some Christian rap or things like that. And I remember some of the Latino youth wanting to. They didn't want that. They didn't want Christian hip hop. They didn't want Christian gospel. They didn't want Spanish Christian music. They kept wanting like Chris Tomlin and Hillsong and Matt Redman and things like this. Not hating on any of those guys. I have them all on my iPod. I love them. But I just thought that it was interesting that so many of the Latino youth who were second generation, cut off from their own history and culture, had more of a preference for Western white Christian music than they did for music that actually was more connected to their own culture and sung by people that looked like them. And so, I mean, but you see this all the time. I mean, it's everywhere. And so it has to be rejected. Otherwise, Christianity won't really be able to be contextualized. Which gets into my last point, which is that for true racial reconciliation to happen, reconciliation has to be done from a place of mutual learning and indigenous leadership, right? It has to be done. True reconciliation has to be done from a place of mutual learning and shared leadership. Oftentimes we want to jump to reconciliation. We want to jump past the difficult things, right? And say, oh, well, we're all just the same. We're all one race. I'm not saying we aren't one race. We are one race. We are all Homo sapiens. But at the same time, we have this social construct called race that does exist. And so to just say, well, we're not all different races, we're all one race, that's not really helping the situation. Because we do speak of different races. And it's not just a new thing, by the way. Race, they didn't call it that, but what we call race was a concept even in the early church, right? That even issues of blackness and whiteness come up even in early Christian literature. So it's not totally just a new thing. But calling it race in the way we think about it today is. But just brushing past these things and acting like we're all the same isn't actually going to address the difficulties that divide us. So I was talking to a brother at our table talking about in his city how one of the big issues is that churches are so divided along racial lines. And so we have to recognize, going back to step one, we have to recognize that it is an issue. It's an issue for everyone, and it's an issue for us. We have a culture. All of us have a culture. There's no non-ethnic people. You know, I hate it when we talk about, oh, we're going to reach the ethnic people. Let's talk with the ethnic. What does that mean? Does that mean that there are certain people that are kind of bound within ethno-historical boundaries and others aren't? That they're like culturalist ghosts floating above everything? No, all of us we're all ethnic people. Every one of us has an ethnos. We are all the ethne. We're all the laos. You know, we're all people that are bound within cultures, right? And we have to realize that, right? And we have to all, so for reconciliation to happen, we all have to be going through, we all have to be going through this like process of mutual learning, of understanding how the gospel, you know, going back to Andrew Walls, he has this other really awesome paradigm that I like to draw from, where he talks about the interaction of the gospel and culture through two principles. One he calls the indigenizing principle, and the other he calls the pilgrim principle. And you guys might have heard this before, but just real quick. The indigenizing principle is the principle that means that God accepts us who we are, right? That God accepts us as we are, that, we don't have to all do the liturgy in Latin. We don't all have to wear Western clothing. We don't all have to, read translated versions of white American authors, in their languages. But, we can all do things as we are, indigenously, right? But the pilgrim principle is the other side of that coin, which is that at the same time, all of our cultures are fallen, and we're all sinful. And so there are sinful aspects of all of our cultures that need to be transformed by the gospel. Everything about our cultures is not good. Black church, the way in which sometimes, just an example, the way in which sometimes we put up our pastors as like these idols that can speak no lie, and this, out of a desire to give respect, but sometimes, too much to the point of thinking that they can say or do no wrong. That's, I think, a broken part of, I need to step away from, sorry. That's a broken part of our culture that I think needs to be changed, right? And everybody has it. Everyone has their strengths, everyone has their weaknesses, right? And the way that, and all of us have to go through this process of figuring out what are the parts of my culture that are actually against the gospel, that have to be transformed. But also, what are the parts of my culture that are good and that can be expressed? And everyone has both of those things, right? Everyone has something good, right? I always hear white people say, I don't have a culture. I wish I was like Chinese or black or Latino, like they have cultures. I don't have a culture. Yes, you do. You do have a culture, right? Everyone has a culture. White people definitely have a culture. Every time I watch Frasier or Seinfeld or Friends or, have, cold cut sandwiches or, whatever, I can see white culture and I like it. I like a lot of it, more than I know. And so everyone has a culture, and it affects how we see the gospel. And we can't really be cross-culturally competent. That is to say, we can't really effectively be doing city-reaching ministry across other groups if we don't understand how our culture is affecting how we see things. And so we have to be able to, put the lens on ourselves as well. And then we can understand better how other people are doing things. And so I think that's about all I want to say, so I hope I'm not over time. But, so I think...